Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth installment of Top Crop Manager's webinar series. My name is Jennifer Page and I'm the Associate Editor of Top Crop Manager. I'm joined today by Dr. Ross McKenzie, who is a retired soil and crop research scientist for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Today, during our free 60-minute session, Dr. McKenzie will be talking about times and rates to seed various cereal and oilseed crops. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. This webinar has also been approved for 0.5 CCA CEUs and 0.5 CCSC CEUs in soil and water management and crop management. Further instructions and submissions will follow the presentation. This session is scheduled to run for about 60 minutes, and Dr. McKenzie will speak for about 45 to 50, at which point we will start a question throughout the presentation. Please type them into the question tab found at the right-hand side of your screen. Without further ado, Mr. McKenzie, please take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jennifer, for the introduction. As Jennifer mentioned, I did work for Alberta Agriculture for many years, more years than I care to count, and I have retired. But what I'm going to do today is talk about one of the studies I did before I actually retired. Looked at optimizing seeding rates and dates for irrigated grain and oilseed crops. And actually, the picture in the first slide here is just actually a picture of one of the sites we actually had where we were looking at flax and canola in terms of seeding rates and dates. So just in terms of introduction, I just thought I'd review some of the factors that can really affect crop establishment. When it comes to irrigated crops and getting really good irrigated crop yields, probably one of the most important things is crop establishment. And so previous crop and crop rotation becomes very important in terms of the year that you're establishing your crop, looking at variety selection, making sure you have the best varieties that are well suited to irrigation for your farm. And in those various things like seed treatment, seed rate, seed depth, seeding date, those are some things I'll be talking about. But other issues that have become very important are fertilizer types and rates, fertilizer placement, seed bed moisture, seed bed soil temperature, soil tilth, and organic matter level in your soil, level of soil tillage, and if there's a hard pan or not, and surface residue cover. So all of these factors really become very, very important in terms of crop management. And then as the season goes on, weed control, disease pressure, insect pressure, looking after those. And finally, but definitely not least important, probably one of the most important is irrigation water application, timing and rates. So all of these really make a huge difference in terms of a crop establishment. And so kind of one point I wanted to make, we have to make sure we do all these things very well and are well managed. That's really critical to getting a crop well established to achieve optimum irrigated crop yields. Now, I just was going to mention that the study that we actually did, it was a 5-experiment study, and we actually looked at a number of things. 2 of the experiments actually looked at nutrient requirements, where we looked at soil nutrients in terms of if they were marginal or deficient in soil, what would be the optimum rates we'd need for each of those different fertilizers to achieve yield, when, what, and how to apply those nutrients, and then just how we can optimize nutrient efficiency. That was a couple of the experiments we had in this study. We had 2 other experiments that just looked at water use in terms of total water requirements for the various crops during the growing season, daily water use, and then managing that through to water application, and looking at effective rooting depths as well. So a couple of experiments in that area too, even looking at holding back water. But I thought I'd just mention those are other key areas that were part of this research study. But what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the morning, or sorry, the afternoon for most of you, is when is the optimum time to seed crops, and what is the optimum seeding rate for these various crops. Now, in terms of background information, when it comes to Southern Alberta, where I did all of this work, irrigation water management is primarily with pivot irrigation. Over 80% of all of the land that we have now in Southern Alberta is irrigated by pivot irrigation, mostly low pressure pivots with drop tubes, which means very efficient water application. And that makes a big difference, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do this study. And then the other factor we wanted to consider was we know that our climate and our weather has been very slowly changing over time, and how would that affect seeding date and seeding rate as well. And I just want to have one qualifier. All of the research trials that I'll be talking about were all conducted in southern Alberta. And so some of the people that are listening are from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And this may or may not be directly applicable to other regions. It's very applicable to southern Alberta. But then to try to extrapolate to other areas, you have to kind of keep that those factors in mind. So the two research sites that we had were, one was at the Lethbridge Agricultural Research Center. It was actually on a Lethbridge soil series. It's probably one of the most common soil series we have in a dark brown soil zone in southern Alberta. And then the other research site was at the Bow Island substation. It was looked after and controlled by Alberta Agriculture. The soil series there was the Chin soil series, and it was probably the most common soil series in the brown soil zone in southern Alberta. And if I had a favorite soil series in Alberta, it would really be the Chin soil series. When it's irrigated, it's very, very productive. And I just wanted to comment that both sites were irrigated with linear move irrigation systems with drop tube and spray nozzles. As a matter of fact, this picture here just shows the linear move system at the Lethbridge Research Center that we used to irrigate all of our research trials. So basically, it looks exactly like a pivot, except it moves linearly down the field, and all the nozzles are exactly the same, applying the same amount of water across the research trials. So I thought I'd just show this picture. This is southern Alberta, showing all of the irrigation districts in southern Alberta. And this ellipse just kind of shows where most of the irrigated land is in southern Alberta. And one of our research trials was Lethbridge, just east of Lethbridge in the dark brown soil zone. The other trial was located south of Bow Island in the brown soil zone. I did comment that we know that our weather and our climate has slowly been changing. So I thought I'd just show you a bit of information from Tabor, which is kind of in now the heart of the irrigated areas of southern Alberta. And I thought I'd just start off with frost-free period. This information actually comes from the Alberta Climate Information Network. And this actually just shows the frost-free period from Tabor, and this is the coordinates for Tabor at the weather station there. Since 1950, or in 1950, the average frost-free period was about 128 days. And so over the last 60 years to 2010, it actually increased to 137 days. So there's been certainly a variation over the years, but on average, we have between 9 and 10 days more in terms of frost-free period now than we did in 1950. And just taking that one step further, looking at the overall growing season, which is really important when we're looking at earlier seeding dates. In 1950, it was about 192 days was the length of our growing season. Now it's almost 220 days, so that it's increased by almost 4 weeks. And that's quite significant when we're thinking about agricultural crop production. If our growing season is 4 weeks longer, what opportunities are there to actually seed earlier? And then the other thing that we look at is heat, not just the length of the season, but the heat, and we can calculate it in terms of growing degree days. And when we use the base of 0 degrees Celsius, growing degree days has increased from 2,623 growing degree days to 2,875. So an increase of over 250 degree days. So we definitely have more heat, almost 10% more heat now than we did in 1950. We can also calculate it using 5 degrees as the base temperature. And in this case, we're increasing from just over 1,700 to basically 1,840 degree days. So again, a significant increase in the amount of heat. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, as our climate has been changing. This is very typical across the prairies of Western Canada. So for this particular study then, we actually looked at 11 different crops. We looked at wheat, hard red spring wheat, soft white spring wheat, prairie spring wheat, and durum. And keep in mind, those are the classes when we started the study. Classes of wheat now are changing. For barley, malt barley, feed barley, and barley silage, we use the same variety for both feed and silage. We also looked at triticale, grain and silage, so using the same variety. And then we also looked at the two oilseed crops, canola and flax. So to start off with, we wanted to look at 4 different seeding dates for each of those crops. We wanted to start a seeding as early as reasonable in southern Alberta, and often we can be seeding by mid-April, and our target was to have our first seeding date somewhere around April 15th to April 20th. And then after that, each seeding date would occur at about 2-week intervals, weather permitting. So it would seed around April 15th, then our next seeding date would be the end of April, around April 30th to May 1st, and then May 15th, and then May 30th. And there was one year we were actually delayed, and our last seeding date was actually the beginning of the 2nd week of June. So it gave us a very good spread of dates. And then we had the 2 sites, Bow Island and Lethbridge, and then we conducted the study for 4 years. So as a result, we actually had 32 site years of actual data. So we had 4 dates times 2 sites times 4 years for each crop. So it gave us 32 data points to actually plot up and work with. And I, again, just want to remind you that all of this work was done in southern Alberta, so be careful in terms of extrapolating that data to other regions. This just shows a picture of our Lethbridge site, the first seeding date, which was in mid-April. So and this picture was actually taken in the first week of July. So that's what barley would look like in the first week of July at first seeding date, second seeding date, third seeding date, and fourth seeding date. And certainly, as a farmer, the more advanced you can have your crop in early July, you'd much prefer to have it at this stage versus this stage. And then you can see the various other cereal crops behind, and then flax and canola in the background. This was rep 1, and everything was always replicated 4 times for our statistical analysis. And again, just another picture. This just shows soft white spring wheat seeded April 25th versus seeding on May 13th. And the picture was taken on June 13th. And certainly when your crop is well established, looking like this in the middle of June, it's able to capture a lot of energy of the sun, and is going to be certainly have an advantage over a crop that's seeded later in May. And we keep in mind on June 15th, we only have another week until June 21st, then where that's the longest day of the year, and then the days start getting shorter. So the earlier you can seed, and for a longer period of time, we're going to be able to capture more energy from the sun. So just a bit of data. I won't show you too many graphs, but this just shows one of our sites at Lethbridge. This is hard red spring wheat, first seeding date, second seeding date, third seeding date, and fourth seeding date. So that's for hard red spring wheat. You can see the trend as we go from first seeding date to last seeding date for soft wheat, for CPS wheat, and then for durum wheat. And that was at one of our Lethbridge sites. And this was barley at Lethbridge. Not much difference between the first and second seeding date for barley, for malt barley, but then we go to second and then third and then fourth seeding date. You can see a downward trend for all 4 dates for feed barley. So that just gives you a sense of what the data would start to look like at individual sites. But to really fair, then we started plotting everything up, all 32 data points for each crop. And I'll just go past this slide to the next one and just show you the actual data for durum wheat. What we actually did for everything that we seeded before May 1st, we just held that constant. That was basically considered to be 100% of yield potential. So long as it on this line here, we know it was 100% or higher from this point. And then really from May 1st, then we started just plotting the trend line to see how things would be affected. So each of these markings will reflect a different site or different year. So there'd be 32 data points here. And this is May 1st. And then this is what the trend line would actually be like. And this would actually suggest, you can see a couple of the sites down here, which was seeded quite a bit later, just how the trend, as we delayed seeding, our yield actually ended up declining. And so this just basically indicates for every day we delayed seeding of durum wheat, we would lose 1.3% of our yield potential per day. So if your target was, say, for example, irrigated durum was your target was say 100 bushels per acre, and you delayed seeding by 20 days after May 1st, well, theoretically, you're going to lose over 25% of your yield potential versus you seeded that same crop, 20 days sooner. So that just shows an example of the data for durum wheat. This shows the data for all 4 wheat types. This is hard red spring. We can see that there's a fair scattering in the points, and you really expect that. You have different weather conditions each spring, and so you're going to have a variation in the data, and that's really why you just don't want to do one site 1 year and draw a conclusion. We wanted to have multiple sites, multiple years, and then that allows us to draw this trend line. And so for hard red spring wheat, for every day we delayed seeding after May 1st, we would lose 0.8 yield potential per day. For CPS wheat, it was 1% per day for every day we delayed seeding. For soft white spring wheat, it was 0.9%, and for durum wheat, it was 1.3%. For the data was fairly tight for durum, but least tight for hard red spring wheat. Then we look at the barley. Maybe we'll look at feed barley first. Again, the data, the trends from May 1st, very clear. We were losing about 1.3% yield every day we delayed seeding for the feed barley. And for barley silage, it was about 1%. And keep in mind that both these, we used exactly the same varieties, or same variety for both feed barley and barley silage on all seeded the same day each of those sites and years. And so they performed somewhat similarly. Then for malt barley, basically the trend was the same as well. We lost about 1.2% for yield potential per day every day we delayed seeding for malt barley. So very similar trends for the barley. I won't worry about showing you the triticale data, but I will show you the two oilseed crops for flax. A bit of variability in that data among years. We had the slope of the line was the least for flax. It was the least influenced by seeding date, but for canola, it was most influenced. And you can see that most of the sites seeded before May 1st yielded at the 100% range, with the exception of one particular year where both Lethbridge and Bow Island were somewhat less. But the trend line was fairly tight. And when you look at the data, it was a very, very strong indication that every day we delayed seeding, we were losing yield potential for canola after May 1st. And it actually worked out to 1.7% yield loss every day that we delayed seeding our irrigated canola at Lethbridge and Bow Island. So to kind of summarize then, we look at yield reduction in terms of percent per day after May 1st. For the cereal crops, they were all right in around that 1% per day, all the way down, and a bit of variation. It ranged kind of from 0.8% for hard red spring wheat to 1.3% for durum and feed barley. The variation was the greatest for canola at 1.7% and least for flax at 0.6%. So what are the benefits of earlier seeding? Well, really, I always kind of like to remind farmers that they're really in the business of harvesting the energy of the sun. And if we can seed a week or 2 weeks earlier and capture more energy, sunlight energy, that's going to be an advantage, and it often is an advantage. So just an example, if we could seed on May 1st, we have 7 weeks before, as the days get longer, before the days start getting shorter. But if we delay seeding to May 21st, we only have 4 weeks for the days to get longer before the days start getting shorter. And so really, the earlier we can seed, the more energy of that sun we can capture, and the greater the yield potential. That is often one of the major reasons why we have benefits for early seeding. We have to also keep in mind that all 11 of these crops are their cool season crops. Seeding these crops earlier gets them through the vegetative stages where they're growing quite nicely when it's somewhat cooler, and really before it really gets hot on the prairies. And often southern Alberta can get very hot in July and August, and the more advanced the crops can be before that summer heat hits, the better off they are. So it really allows those crops to be growing vegetatively when it's somewhat cooler, and often that just means improved water use efficiency. We're using less water to keep those plants cool, so utilize the water more efficiently, and you wind up getting more yield per inch of water that you're actually applying. And the other advantage is sometimes by getting that crops off to a good start, they get ahead of weeds, and that's an advantage. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is that sometimes we have diseases like stripe rust blowing in. Typically, they might tend to blow in during July. And the more advanced your crop is, when disease moves in or insect pests move in, the less effect they're going to have in terms of overall crop yield. So in terms of summary of the seeding date work we did then, delaying seeding after May 1st resulted in the greatest decline for canola and the least for flax. So how would you manage that? Well, in southern Alberta, if you can actually start seeding in mid-April, and 3 out of the 4 years we were doing this study, we were able to seed right in or by around April 15th. I would suggest you want to seed your highest value cereal crops first, followed by your lower value cereal crops. But if by late April, then you should start be thinking about seeding canola. And I get very worried about canola. It is very sensitive to frost, so I'd be reluctant to seed it in mid-April just because of the higher frost risk. But as you move from mid to late April, the frost risk starts to decline. But you always want to keep frost risk in mind. But if you can start seeding or be seeding in late April, why not seed canola and then go back to seeding your highest value cereal crops, then your lower value cereal crops, and then finally flax. I kind of suggest seeding flax last, just simply because it was the least affected by seeding date. Then you also have to kind of keep in mind what are the other crops you have on the farm. What other crops might you want to seed early? Well, we certainly know peas are very tolerant to frost, and their growing point, they can actually grow from below ground if they do get a hard frost. So peas are another crop you can seed early, and look at the special crops you might grow on a farm. If you're growing potatoes, seeding potatoes early certainly has an advantage. For corn, it's a C4 crop. It needs a fair amount of heat, and it really won't grow much below 10 degrees Celsius, so not much point in putting corn in really early. But you would want to put it in by around May 1st. Sugar beets are very sensitive to frost. However, sugar beet growers are quite willing to take that frost risk and get sugar beets early into the ground, because they know the earlier they get them in, the better they're going to be. And then compare that to another crop like dry bean, which is very sensitive to frost, and there's really no point in seeding that before about the third week of May. So you really want to look at all of your crops and look at the advantage or disadvantage of seeding early. I will just make one other point with cereal crops. I have no problem seeding them in mid-April, and even if you did in the remote chance you really get a very, very hard frost that freezes the above ground growth. The good thing about cereal crops is that their growing point is below ground, so even if in the worst case, if they get a bit of frost, they can still come back from below ground and carry on and still do better than if you delayed seeding. So the next thing that I'll talk about is seeding rate on crop yields. Again, we looked at the same 11 crops, and we seeded each crop at 5 different rates, and usually the last week of April or the last 2 days of April was our target to seed this particular experiment. So cereal crops, we actually seeded 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500 seeds per square meter. And just to put that in perspective in terms of seeds per square foot, which is what most people think about, 100 seeds per square meter is about the same as 9 seeds per square foot. 200 seeds per square meter is the same as about 19 seeds per square foot. And then 300 is the same as 28, 400 same as about 37, and 500 seeds per square meter is the same as about 47 seeds per square foot. So those are the rates we use for the cereal crops. For flax, we seeded a rates from 200 to 600 seeds per square meter. And for canola, we seeded from 75 seeds all the way up to 275. And in retrospect, we should have probably not had the higher rates and gone to lower rates, and you maybe see why as we're going through the data. And again, we had sites at both Lethbridge and Bow Island, and we did a study for 4 years. So we had 5 seeding rates times 2 sites times 4 years, which actually gave us 40 data points for each crop. And again, just a reminder that all the work was done in Southern Alberta, so these results are very applicable to Southern Alberta, but you have to use care to extrapolate it to elsewhere on the prairies. So just as an example of seeding rates with the various wheat types of Lethbridge hard red spring wheat, the lowest seeding rate of 100 to the highest seeding rate of 500. In this particular site and year, there was really no benefit from going to higher seeding rates, but exactly the opposite for soft white spring wheat. Very nice response to increased seeding rates. For CPS wheat, nice response up to 300, then leveled off. And for durum, nice response pretty much up to 500. Then we just look at another site at a different year, Bow Island. A bit of response initially with the hard red spring wheat up to 200, but then kind of leveled off, even dropped off a bit. A nice response with the soft white spring wheat. CPS, nice response to 300 and then leveled off. With durum, nice response and leveled off. And this is what you're going to find, different sites, different years. You're always going to have that variation. And again, the reason why you want to do multiple sites in multiple years to come up with reasonable trend lines. And this just shows an example of barley and triticale. A lot of silage is grown in Southern Alberta by the feedlot industry. And in this particular case, for both barley and triticale, very nice response from 100 all the way up to a seeding rate of 500 seeds per square meter. And again, this just looks at all the data points for all of the crops, and they'll just have a look at one. We'll just pick on the soft white spring wheat. So the first seeding rate at 100, you see there's a real spread in terms of where the yield is. This is 100% of yield potential, and we can see quite a spread in the different years. Then when we increase from 100 seeding rate to 200, then the spread starts to diminish and is a little tighter. Go to 300, so you increase by another 100 seeds per square meter. Again, the spread becomes tighter, and finally up here at 400 and 500, the spread is quite quite tight. So then we have our best fit line shown here, and then this line and this line show the lower and upper limits for the optimum seeding rate for this particular crop, looking at all of the data. So for soft white spring wheat, then seeding somewhere between 300 and 450 seeds per square meter would kind of be the ideal range to be in to hit optimum yield consistently year after year. Certainly, some of the sites even seeded at very low rates. They did well some years, but other years did dismally. So you want to be in a position where you're going to be seeding at that optimum rate year after year to get your best yield. And really, in my opinion, probably your best to be kind of in this range, about halfway in between the lower and the upper line, or maybe slightly less than halfway, to really kind of achieve your optimum yield potential. So in this particular case, somewhere between 350 and 400 seeds per square meter would be the ideal rate for soft white spring wheat. And we'll just kind of pull back. We just talked about soft white spring wheat and just look at the trends for durum. Again, a wide spread at the low seeding rate, but then things started to tighten up as we increased our seeding rates. For durum, probably somewhere between 275, 425 seeds per square meter was the optimum range, but probably somewhere around 375 would be the rate you'd want to be. For CPS wheat, a little lower in terms of optimum seeding rates, probably 225 to around 350. So seeding around 300 seeds per square meter would be kind of the optimum. And then finally for CPS wheat it benefited the least from that higher seeding rate, but it also has a lower yield potential versus the other three wheat types. So somewhere between 200 and 300 seeds was kind of the optimum range. So seeding around 250 seeds per square meter for a hard red spring would be kind of a good target. So that looks at hard red spring wheat. Now we'll just look at barley. Let's look at feed barley first. Somewhere between 200 and 350 was kind of the optimum range to be. And you can always see the spread is the greatest at the lowest seeding rate, and at the highest seeding rates it was the least. But we want to be on kind of the optimum point of the curve where we're going to get optimum yield and not spend too much money on seed. And we also have to keep in mind, as we increase seeding rate, that also means there's hormones in the plants that are going to cause, when you have plant competition, they're going to cause those plants to be competitive and actually grow a little bit taller, and then could actually set the crop up for a bit of additional lodging. So you want to kind of be on this point of the curve for your optimum yield, but not too high up to start being worried about things like crop lodging under irrigation. Now keep in mind, feed barley and barley silage, we use the same variety, was a Vavar, but quite a bit difference in response and a lot more spread in the points with the barley silage versus barley for feed. But for barley feed, we're taking that off for grain, and here we're harvesting the barley. We're taking the full biomass, above ground biomass, so a little bit more variability. But typically, we're kind of between 300 and 450 is kind of our optimum rate, because we're looking at total biomass and trying to produce the most total biomass for barley silage. Then finally, we look at malt barley. Probably a little less than 200 to about 250 would be kind of the optimum seeding rate for malt barley. And here we're actually seeing a slight decline in yield if we go to too high a rate. And we also have to keep in mind with malt barley, to make malt, you really have to have 80% of your seed with plump kernels. And the higher you go with seeding rate, the more competition, and the smaller the seed size in the seed you're going to harvest, you'll have more thin seed. So really, this is kind of your optimum range right here to achieve optimum yield and quality. And then finally, we'll just look at canola and flax. There was a nice response to seeding rate with flax, somewhere between 350 and not quite 500 seeds would be the optimum range for seeding flax, but 400 would be kind of the ideal target. But to be honest, when we looked at canola, that curve was almost flat, and really our lower line and upper line really kind of comes at around 175 to about 175 seeds per square meter. But to be honest, really, I would suggest if you're kind of between 75 and 125, or even 75 and 100 plants under irrigation, that still puts you pretty much at the peak of the curve, and you're going to be in pretty good shape from an optimum yield potential. And in retrospect, we probably should have had some seeding dates that were lower, not at higher in this particular case, but it's kind of live and learn. So in terms of the summary of the seeding rate trials, I'll just show you seeds per square meter. So for malt barley, that was kind of the optimum range in terms of seeds per square meter. And I just converted it to seeds per square foot for you. So kind of between 17 and 24 was the range. I'd go about halfway in between. And with the varieties we were using, I just kind of calculated what would that actually be in terms of pounds per acre for a seeding rate, just as an example. So that would be kind of the range for malt barley. Feed barley kind of between 19 and 33. So I would suggest typically in that closer to 30 plants per square foot would be the ideal for feed barley. For barley silage, probably more in range of 35 to 40 plants would be the per square foot would be the ideal range. Triticale around getting close to 30 plants per square foot. Triticale silage, it actually responded all the way up to that 500 seeds per square meter or 47 seeds per square foot. So probably if you're in that 40 to 45 plants per square foot would be the ideal range. Hard red spring wheat, probably around 25 would be the ideal. Soft white spring wheat, probably in that 35 to 40 plants per square foot or seeds per square foot. CPS around 35, 30 to 35. Durum, 35 to 40. And in canola, these are kind of the ranges I gave at 75 to 125 seeds per square meter, which would be around 7 to 12 per square foot. But really, looking at our data, I'd almost be really inclined to say kind of between 7 and 10 plants per square foot would really be the ideal. And finally, for flax, a range from around 350 to 500. And if you're in that 40 to 45 target range, that would be kind of the ideal. Now, whenever you're going to be seeding, you really want to be looking at seeds per square foot or seeds per square meter. And then you want to seed it in terms of pounds per acre. And you really want to go to either I'll just use the example of the Alberta Agriculture seeding rate calculator. I just gave you the website for Alberta Agriculture to go to the seeding rate calculator. Saskatchewan and Manitoba both have seed rate calculators on their website as well. So looking at that is very important. I'm going to show you an example in just a minute. But the other thing I'm really big on is when we're seeding our irrigated crops, we want to use certified seed, or if you're going to be using your own seed, make sure it's tested for germination, for seed vigor, and seed-borne disease. You want to make sure you're using good, plump, very healthy seed. If you use thin seed or poorer seed, then all the other things you might do in terms of optimum seeding date or rate might be for naught if you're not using good quality seed. So this is really critical. Then the other thing is seed as shallow as reasonable into moist, firm soil. So let's just kind of go back then and just talk about the seed rate calculator first. When you go to the Alberta Agriculture website, you have various things you can select, and one of them is decision-making tools. Then you just go to the serial seeding rate calculator. In this particular case, I've just selected soft white spring wheat. The best variety now, the variety we used was AC Andrew that came out of the Canada breeding program on Lethbridge. Probably the best variety now is Sadash, named after Dr. Sadash Satisfaya, who is the breeder. And we actually selected, or in this particular case, I selected the seeding rate of 35 seeds per square foot. I assumed that the germination rate would be 95%. Now, typically for the seeding rate calculator mortality, they usually suggest to pick about 3%. But to be honest, under irrigation, if you're seeding a little bit earlier, conditions are maybe a little bit more harsh, I'd suggest you're using at least 5% and maybe even as high as 10%. Then input your row spacing. Then the next critical thing is 1,000 kernel weight. So you want to make sure for your seed, do 1,000 kernel weight and enter that. Now in this particular case, the average for Sadash is actually 39, but you want to enter your actual value so you can very accurately calculate pounds per acre that you actually have to seed. If you know the acres and the price, you can do a bit of economics for you in terms of some costs as well. Then once you've entered that information, you just click calculate, and this is the kind of information you're going to get. So we've got soft white spring wheat, the variety is Sadash. The kernel weight we used was 39 grams, and this will tell us we have to seed around 153 pounds of wheat per acre to obtain 35 live plants per square foot. and it actually gives you some information for calibration as well. So that's based on the information you input, and you might say, well, 35 might be a little high, I might want to go back to 30, or 35 might be a little low, I might want to try 40. So then you can change these values and then actually recalculate. But it's very important to look at your optimum seed, your target seeding rate in terms of seeds per square foot, and then enter that in, and then actually do a calculation to figure out how many pounds you actually really want to seed to achieve that target plant population. Now, I thought I'd just also mention a few other things that I think that are very important. This just shows barley, and it's not part of the research study, but just we used to do a diagnostic field school for farmers at Lethbridge that I was involved with. And this just shows where we seeded barley at 1 inch depth, and then that same seed seeded at 2 inch depth. And so the 1 inch emergence is certainly better than the 2 inch emergence, and we just kind of pull back. That's 1 inch seeding depth, 2 inch seeding depth, and then 3 inch seeding depth. And bottom line is, as we start to seed a little deeper, any seed that's a little bit thinner or a little bit weaker is not going to survive and push through that soil 2 inches to emerge, or push 3 inches through the soil and emerge. So the deeper you seed, as that seeding depth is increased, seeding emergence is gradually going to be decreased. And that's just a fact of life. And so when we're trying to achieve optimum yield, we really want to try and seed as shallow as reasonable. I'm not going to say always seed 1 inch, but try to seed as shallow as possible into moisture. As long as you're seeding into moisture, don't put it in deeper than what you really have to. And the shallower you seed, then the less distance that cotyledon will have to push through soil to break through the soil and emerge. And if you're unlucky enough to have a bit of a rain and a soil crust, the shallower you seed, the more easy it is going to be for that seedling to break through that crust as well. And this is just another example from our diagnostic field school a few years ago. We just took certified seed and we just screened it from and separated thin seed versus plump seed. So it's all out of the same bag, certified seed. So it's good quality seed, but some seed is going to be a little plumper, some seed is going to be a little thinner. And then we just seeded the plump seed at 1.5 inches and the thin seed at 1.5 inch depth. And clearly the plump seed has got more energy and more vigor. And so you're going to get better emergence with the plump seed than the thin seed seeded at 1.5 inches. And then we take that same seed, seeding that plump seed 3 inches deep and thin seed 3 inches in depth. And boy, when you see that thin seed seed another 1.5 inches deeper at 3 inches, that thin seed just doesn't have the energy to push all the way through and emerge. So seeding depth and good quality seed is actually very, very important as well. And I really can't stress that enough when we're talking about seeding date and seeding rate. These other factors have to be taken into consideration as well. So just a few comments then to start to wrap things up. Use certified seed or use good quality plump seed. And if you're using your own seed, test for germination, vigor, and disease, and make sure you have good quality seed. Seed as shallow as reasonable into moisture, and sometimes it's drier, so you're going to have to seed a little deeper, but always seed as shallow as reasonable into moisture. Like I mentioned, sometimes the soil's a little drier, and if soil is dry down to say 2.5 to 3 inches, would you be better off to irrigate first, improve soil moisture, and then seed into a nice moist seed bed and seed as shallow as reasonable? That is certainly something that I always encourage farmers to think about. Versus the other choice is seeding into dry soil, seed shallow, and then irrigate, and then try to irrigate that crop up. And one of the problems with many of our irrigated soils, they're in drier regions with lower organic matter levels, and so soil crusting is often a problem after you irrigate. And so if you seeded and then you irrigate, the soil crusts, and then that crop is going to have a little harder time breaking through that crust, and that's going to reduce stand establishment. So that becomes a real dilemma, because there are sometimes in most irrigation districts in southern Alberta, irrigation water isn't available till early May. On average, it's usually around the end of the first week of May. So you can start seeding, say, on April 20th, but the soil is dry, so you're going to have to put it in deeper. And if you don't get rain, then by the end of the first week of May, then you're going to have to start irrigating that crop up and then worry about crusting. Or if you seed on April 20th, and you have variable moisture, some of your seed is in moisture and some of it's not, then you're going to get patchy emergence, and I just hate to see that. So those are some of the dilemmas, because most irrigation districts just really can't provide water much sooner than the beginning of May, just because in some cases there's still frost in the ground in a few places around their drop structures and whatnot, and the districts just don't want to put water into their canals earlier than what they have to. So that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind. So in terms of summary comments, then, consider seeding cereal crops in mid to late April if soil moisture and temperature conditions allow. And then depending on where you are, how does this compare to your normal practice? And definitely in southern Alberta, seeding our cereal crops in mid to late April really makes very good sense. If you can get it into moisture and get good germination, getting that crop in earlier is certainly going to be beneficial from a yield potential. Now, for other crops like canola, though, you really have to consider frost risk, and I wouldn't encourage seeding canola in mid-April, but certainly in the last few days of April, once you're in the beginning of May, the frost risk starts to really drop off, and so I'd definitely be considering seeding canola at the end of April or very beginning of May, if at all possible, especially when you consider that as we start to delay seeding of canola, that yield potential really starts to drop off. And then the other thing to look at is seeding rates. Again, for those of you in southern Alberta, I feel very confident in the seeding rates recommendations I provided. For those of you outside of southern Alberta, again, just be careful with your extrapolation of the data. What I would suggest is, for those of you outside of southern Alberta, consider seeding a portion of your crops at a higher seeding rate you might think would be reasonable, but don't seed all your crop at that. Seed a portion of it, maybe 20 or 30% of a field, and seed the rest at a normal rate, and do that for a couple of years, and then evaluate, would these higher seeding rates improve your yield potential or not, and do a bit of your own on-farm evaluation to kind of see what would be reasonable if you start bumping up your seeding rates. What would be reasonable in your particular situation for your region where you actually farm. So that pretty much wraps things up. I just want to make a couple of points. All of the information that I've talked about for this particular research study, where we looked at optimum seeding date and rate for irrigated crops, we did write an AgDex publication. It's actually on the Alberta Agriculture website. That's the title. This is the AgDex number. So everything I've talked about, all the graphs and the tables, are all in this AgDex on the Alberta Agriculture website. And just for interest, from an irrigation and fertilizer standpoint, we did have these other experiments. So one of them was developing fertilizer recommendations, nitrogen fertilizer response curves. We did that at the same time. And so there's an AgDex publication called Fertilizer Requirements for Irrigated Grain and Oilseed Crops. And here's the AgDex number for it. It's also on the Alberta Agriculture website. So certainly we'll refer to that too to help you in your decision making from a fertilizer requirement standpoint. So that's about it. Just as a reminder, I'm just an old retired guy now with white hair, but I have given you my email address. Here's my phone number. I'm not home that much, but here's my email address. If you ever have a question, feel free to email me your questions and even give me a phone number. I'd be happy to call you back. I do have a Twitter account that I don't use a lot, but the best way to communicate with me would really be by email. And today is also Canada Ag Day, so happy Canada Day, and it's just about 1:45 to our Alberta time, so maybe I'll wrap it up. I'll turn it back to Jennifer, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer or address any questions you might have.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. McKenzie. It was a great presentation. We do have a few questions here for you. So I'll start here. In a normal spring, would you seed peas ahead of malt barley?
Actually, I'd look at the yield potential and the actual value of the crop you're kind of expecting the next fall. What is the value of the peas and the yield, and what is the value of the malt barley and the yield potential? And that's kind of how I would decide. But to be honest, I would have, really, if I had a choice, I'd almost be inclined to seed peas earlier, just because it's a shorter season crop, and peas are really affected by early summer heat. Matter of fact, often once the air temperature is above 25 degrees Celsius for a short period of time, that can actually terminate flowering of pea. So if you could seed on April 15th, I think I'd almost be inclined to seed pea first and malt barley second, to be honest.
The next question, have there been any seeding rate trials done with a soil moisture monitoring during the growing season?
Actually, all of our trials were all monitored with moisture. We used an instrument called the neutron probe, and moisture was actually measured in every one of our research trials every week. As a matter of fact, sometimes in peak use times, we're actually measuring it twice a week. And then we can make sure we were timing, because there are times where, say, hard red spring wheat, soft white spring wheat, durum wheat can actually be using up to 10 millimeters of water per day. And then if we're looking at kind of the effective root zone is about a half a meter for those crops, or you look at the water holding capacity in that half meter, really in a 4-day period, we actually use up that plant available water down to a safe depletion point of 60%. So we always measured soil moisture in all these research trials, and we always tried to make sure that we never drop below a 60% safe depletion point in that root zone. So we always maintain moisture between 60% of field capacity, 100% of field capacity. So these crops were never ever suffering from a lack of water.
Great. In your opinion, what would be the main reason why seeding cereal crops a bit earlier would result in higher yield, crop yield potential? Right.
Well, probably the first reason is really capturing the energy of the sun, and that's, as I kind of commented, that is really important. If we instead of seeding on maybe the second week of May, if we can bump that to the third week of April, so we're going to look at maybe 3 weeks longer or sooner than when the crop is in the ground, and so it's going to be up sooner. Earlier in the season, it's going to be cooler, so it's going to be using less water, so it's going to be more water use efficient. If we're going to seed a little bit earlier, hopefully it might tiller out a little bit better. And it's also, once it's actively growing earlier, it's going to be able to capture more energy of the sun, and that's just going to wind up with a higher yield potential overall. So kind of capturing energy of the sun, better water use efficiency, and even a few other things like being a little bit more competitive with weeds. And like I said, sometimes from a disease standpoint, you have disease or insects move in early July, depending on the crop you're growing. The more advanced that crop is, the more it can resist the effects on that crop in terms of the effect on crop yield.
Do you think farmers in southwest Saskatchewan should consider early seeding after the 15th or the 20th of April?
Well, in southwest Saskatchewan, they're actually in the brown soil zone, very similar to farmers in southeastern Alberta, for example, Bow Island, Tabor, Vauxhall, Brooks, they're all in the brown soil zone, and farmers in southwestern Saskatchewan are basically in that same zone with a very similar climatic conditions. So I would think that always the results of this study might be not completely directly applicable. It's going to be very similar, and I would certainly think that from an irrigation standpoint, if they can seed a week or 2 weeks earlier, I think that oftentimes they would find that would be beneficial as well.
And for those who are double cropping barley with ryegrass or another annual grass, is there a good place to get information on recommendations of seeding rates?
That's something I haven't done any work with. There is a fellow at the Lethbridge Research Center, Dr. Larson, I believe his name is doing a bit of work in that area. So he might be the person to contact. Also, Dr. Brian Barris at the Lethbridge Research Center is doing a lot of cereal crop work, and he might be a good person to talk to. Now, in my case, I haven't done any work, so I really couldn't comment on ideal seeding rates in that particular case. Sorry about that.
Did you find any relationship with fusarium head blight incidents in early seeding versus late seeding?
Well, typically, if you can seed a little bit earlier, that is a bit of an advantage. The earlier the crop is heading, sometimes you can avoid some of that issue. But one of the big things we always say with irrigated wheat is it just about 3 days after the crop is fully headed out, you really want to cut your water off during that time where the crop is actually flowering. And so typically for the 4 wheat types that we grow, about 3 to 4 days after that crop is fully headed out, that's when the crop is flowering, and it will be flowering for about 5 to 7 days. So if you can, just terminate your watering for about that 7-day period while the crop is actually in flowering stage, to reduce humidity and try to help in terms of reducing the incidence of fusarium. But I would hope that if you can seed it earlier, it would help to reduce the impact of fusarium. But irrigation management is the other factor you'd have to look at as well.
And so why would there be such a marked difference between spring wheat and durum yields due to seeding rate?
That's a good question. I think that other than, to be honest, I wasn't really expecting that, but that's just the way it worked out. But hard red spring wheat really has been bred over the years, specifically bred for dryland, pushed to try and breed hard red spring wheat specifically for irrigation, primarily because we're looking at trying to get high protein, and it's always harder to get high protein under irrigation. So because you have to really start to push the nitrogen. But hard red spring wheat just doesn't have that same yield potential under optimum moisture that durum does. And then durum is not as good as CPS wheat, and CPS wheat is not as good as soft white spring wheat. For soft white spring wheat, we actually don't want a high protein content. We want a higher starch level, and it's really been bred specifically for irrigation. And to be honest, I much prefer to see farmers grow soft white spring wheat under irrigation, just because it has a much better yield potential and also stands up better than some of the other wheat types under irrigation as well. But that's really historic in the way that these crops have been developed from a breeding standpoint.
And what are your thoughts on how this information would apply to non-irrigated crops in South Central Alberta?
Well, certainly the seeding date work, I think, would be very applicable to farmers in southern and central Alberta. Matter of fact, after we did this study, we actually wanted to do a seeding rate and date study across the province in all the major agroecological areas, but we could never get funding for it. The funding agencies, we just know if you seed earlier, you're going to be better. But that's, from my standpoint, that was never good enough. And we did do some seeding rate work with soft white spring wheat and CPS wheat in central Alberta for 3 years. Not a long enough study, but with just a 3-year study we did at 4 locations. And that work is on the Alberta Agriculture website from a fertility standpoint and a seeding rate standpoint, but not from a seeding date standpoint. And I think that there's really no question in my mind, if you go to a place like Red Deer, we know that our Frostfree period is almost 3 weeks longer in the Red Deer area now than what it was in 1950. So there's really no doubt in my mind, but if a farmer can seed earlier, you'd probably be wise to do so with the cereal crops. But then with crops like canola, you always want to pay attention to not seed canola too early because of the frost risk. But I think that the seeding date work would be quite applicable to farmers in both southern and central Alberta.
And does different seeding rates have any effect on cereal leaf disease incidence or not?
Well, really, from an irrigation standpoint, we're going to optimum seeding rates, and then that means that plant density is going to be very tight. And when we're irrigating, especially with pivots, oftentimes at peak water use, we're irrigating maybe every 4 days. So we're keeping the canopy moist, and there's the high humidity. And it's really the irrigation with the high humidity and the increased plant density that all contribute to a better, or maybe not a better, but I suppose a better environment for disease to develop. So we're going to those higher seeding rates to achieve optimum yield, but it also gives us a much denser canopy. And then when we're irrigating, we're going to have a much more humid environment, which is going to promote disease. So then we have to be very careful when we're selecting varieties, to select varieties for the diseases that you're concerned about, and then maybe consider you might need to be using a fungicide application, whether it's on canola or a cereal crop, to manage disease risk. But now the other factor that is, if you look in southern Alberta last year, we were very dry throughout all of July and all of August. We had almost no precipitation and very low humidity. So that's when irrigation really shines. We're putting on the water when we need it. but the air is still dry enough that we really didn't see hardly any disease pressure last year, just because of the very dry conditions, even with our irrigated crops with frequent irrigation. But we have to accept the fact we're going to get optimum yield. We have to go to optimum seeding rates, and then we're going to increase the potential for disease with our irrigation and our dense canopies.
And I just have one final question here for you. So we're wondering if there has been any studies done with variable rate seeding.
Not a lot. I certainly did quite a bit of work before I retired with variable rate fertilizer application, and even variable rate fertilizer application becomes a bit of a stretch when you're seeding in low relief, mid relief, and high relief areas. So like on hilltops versus side slopes versus lower slopes, you're going to have a range of soil organic matter levels, range of soil moisture situations. But there hasn't been an awful lot of really good work done on seeding rates for variable rate seeding. And in my opinion, we need to do much more in the areas of variable rate fertilizer and variable rate seeding. And oftentimes people are looking at their knolls and say, well, that's really where I should be cutting back on our fertilizer. It's less productive. But on the other hand, these areas tend to be lower in soil organic matter. They will definitely benefit from manure application. And if you have good moisture, they'll definitely benefit from increased nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer application, sometimes even sulfur application. And so then if you have good moisture and you have good fertility, then you don't want to really be cutting your seeding rates. So there's a lot of different sort of dynamics that come into play. And to be honest, I usually encourage farmers when in a year where you have normal to above normal moisture, actually you should probably be putting on a bit more fertilizer on your hilltops and using the same seeding rate on those hilltops as you would in your lower areas to try and achieve optimum yield. But there's a lot of factors that come into play depending on environmental conditions and soil moisture and that kind of thing. So you can't just say always use a higher seeding rate on the hilltop or always use a lower seeding rate. There's a lot of other factors that come into play that we could talk about for at length for a while.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation today. Dr. McKenzie, we really appreciate it. It was a lot of good information. Before we end today, I just wanted to say again that this webinar has been approved for 0.5 CCA and 0.5 CCSC credits. To get those credits, you can submit your first and last name and your CCA, CCSC numbers to webinars@annexweb.com. These instructions will also be found in our follow-up email, which also holds the recording of the webinar. Your credits should be processed within the next couple of weeks, but could take up to 4 to 6 weeks. You should see our follow-up email in your inbox within the next 24 hours. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Ross McKenzie. And before we sign off, I would also like to remind attendees of Top Crop Manager's upcoming event. The 2018 Herbicide Resistance Summit will be held on February 27th and 28th in Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan. As the date fast approaches, there are only a select number of tickets left, so be sure to register today. You can visit weedsummit.ca for more information. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Have a great day.